At 4 p.m., a needle was ready. A dog that had broken 4 handlers, shredded reinforced steel, and sat in total silence while everyone else screamed, was scheduled to die before sunset. Nobody could get near him. Nobody could explain him. The shelter director had already signed the paperwork. Then a one-legged veteran walked through the door with a cane, no appointment, and no idea that the animal everyone called a monster already knew his name. What happened in the next 11 minutes would stop a lethal injection, reopen classified military files, and change both their lives forever. If stories like this move you, hit subscribe right now. Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. And stay with me until the very end, because what comes next will wreck you in the best possible way. The rain came sideways that afternoon. It wasn't the soft Pacific Northwest kind that people romanticize, the kind that dots your jacket and smells like cedar. This was northern Montana rain, late October, arriving horizontally off the Rockies with wind behind it that cut straight through denim and into bone. It hammered the aluminum roof of the Redstone Valley Animal Center like gravel being dumped from a truck, and it had been doing so since 2 o'clock without pause or apology. Inside the shelter, nobody noticed. They had other problems. Megan Brooks stood at the counter in the front office with a ballpoint pen in her right hand and a single sheet of paper on the desk in front of her. The paper had her name pre-printed at the bottom. All it needed was her signature. She'd signed dozens of these in 6 years as shelter director. Feral cats with distemper, dogs with bone cancer, animals so broken by abuse that mercy was the only honest thing left. She had never enjoyed it, but she'd always been able to do it without falling apart. This one was different. This one felt like something else entirely, and she couldn't explain why. Megan? Dave Parrish, her head veterinarian, leaned against the doorframe with his arms folded and his voice carefully neutral. He was 53 years old, gray at the temples, and wore the expression of a man who had learned a long time ago not to argue with inevitability. The board's been calling since noon. Insurance gave us until close of business. I know when close of business is. It's 3:45. She knew that too. The pen moved to the paper. Her hand stopped. Down the hall, past the main kennel room, past the supply closet, past the door marked authorized personnel only, in faded red letters. Something made a sound. Not a bark. Not a howl. A single heavy impact against reinforced steel, rhythmic and deliberate, like a fist knocking 3 times and then going silent, like something signaling. Dave straightened. He's been doing that since morning. I know. It doesn't mean anything, Megan. She looked at the paper. No, it probably doesn't. She signed it. His name, according to the intake form, was Shadow. No registered owner. No chip scan result beyond a corrupted read that the system couldn't decode. He had been found 9 weeks earlier by a county animal control officer named Ray Stubbs, running loose along Route 12 near the Flathead Reservation boundary, approximately 60 pounds of muscle and scar tissue, and barely contained fury moving at a dead sprint toward a passing semi-truck. Ray had gotten a catch-pole around his neck by what he later described as either divine intervention or temporary insanity. The dog had dragged him 15 feet before he'd hit the latch on the truck's rear bumper and stopped himself. At the shelter, the chaos started within 48 hours. Handler Carl Reyes, experienced, calm, former animal control, had gone into the kennel with standard equipment and a positive approach. Shadow had let him get 3 feet inside the door before launching. Carl came out with a torn sleeve, a punctured forearm, and 11 stitches. He quit the following morning without giving notice. 2 weeks later, a volunteer named Patricia tried to slide a food bowl under the kennel gate. Shadow flipped the bowl, raked the gate with both paws in a specific pattern. Not random scratching, but deliberate strikes. Upper left, lower right, upper left. And stared at her with yellow eyes that she described to Megan later as not like a dog's eyes. Like he was filing information. The third incident involved a repairman who'd come to service the HVAC unit near the isolation corridor. He had not entered the kennel. He had simply walked past it. Shadow had hit the reinforced door so hard the frame cracked along one corner. The repairman drove away and never returned the company's calls. He's not a dog, one of the younger volunteers had said after that. He's a weapon that someone lost the instructions to. Nobody corrected her. What made it worse, what made it genuinely unnerving in a way that Carl Reyes still talked about at the bar on weekends, was the silence. Most dogs in distress were loud. They barked, they whined, they paced and cried and filled the air with noise. Shadow was quiet. Between his deliberate attacks on handlers and equipment, he sat in the back corner of the kennel in absolute stillness and watched the hallway with the focused patience of something that was waiting. Not for food, not for exercise, for something specific that hadn't arrived yet. It was the waiting that scared people most. Megan had written in the behavioral assessment, "Dog displays reactive aggression consistent with severe trauma history and possible previous high-drive working background. Rehabilitation potential? Unknown. Public safety risk? High. Recommend evaluation by specialist before euthanasia decision." The board had read that recommendation and responded with 4 words. "We have no specialist." That had been 3 weeks ago. Ethan Mercer had not wanted to come. That was the simplest and most accurate thing about the afternoon. He had not wanted to be in that truck. He had not wanted to be in Redstone Valley. And he had absolutely not wanted to be pulling into the gravel parking lot of an animal shelter at 3:47 p.m. in horizontal rain while his left knee did the thing it did in cold weather, which was to grind like a coffee grinder with a rock in it and send shooting pain up into his hip every 3rd step. He sat in the truck for 2 minutes before moving. The cane was in the back seat. He reached for it, hesitated, grabbed it anyway. He'd made the mistake of not taking it on a good day last month and had gone down on a patch of ice outside the grocery store in front of a woman and her 2 kids. He wasn't doing that again. The therapist's name was Dr. Sandra Chu. She worked out of a small practice in Kalispell, and she was the 3rd therapist Ethan had seen in 4 years, the only one he'd seen more than twice. She was 50, Vietnamese American, barely 5 feet tall, and completely immune to the particular brand of quiet hostility that combat veterans used to end conversations they didn't want to have. She'd served 2 years as an Army psychologist at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany, which meant she'd seen men who'd come back from places nobody was allowed to talk about, and she didn't flinch at anything he said. 3 weeks ago, she'd told him about the shelter. "I'm not a dog person," he'd said. "You don't have to be a dog person. You have to be a person who needs something that isn't a bottle of whiskey at 2 in the morning." He'd looked at the wall. "That's not Ethan." He'd stopped. "You're not sleeping. You're not eating consistently. You're isolating in that cabin for stretches of 10 and 12 days, and the only human contact you're having is our 50-minute sessions. Something needs to change or the trajectory here is very predictable, and I don't want to be reading about you in the Flathead Beacon." He hadn't said anything to that. He didn't have anything to say. "A dog is not going to fix you," she'd continued. "That's not what I'm saying, but a living thing that needs you to show up, that creates an external requirement for you to get out of bed. That's not therapy. That's just structure. And structure is what you need right now." He'd agreed to visit the shelter. He hadn't agreed to do it cheerfully. The woman at the front desk, young, with a Montana State lanyard, and the specific exhausted energy of someone who'd been dealing with something stressful all day, looked up when he pushed through the door. "Hi, can I help you?" "Here to look at dogs." She glanced at the clock, then at him, at the cane, at the way he held his shoulders, at the particular stillness of someone who'd learned to assess a room without moving his head. Something in her expression shifted slightly. "We're actually getting ready to close for the—" She stopped. Started again. "What kind of dog are you looking for?" "Quiet. Older. Something low energy." She nodded, moved out from behind the counter. "Follow me. I'll show you the main kennel. We have some good dogs right now, actually. There's a 7-year-old lab mix named The Impact Hit from down the hall. 3 beats. A pause. 3 more." Ethan stopped walking. The girl kept going for 2 steps before she realized he wasn't with her. She turned. "Oh, that's just... We have an animal in isolation. That's not available for..." "What's in isolation?" "A Belgian Malinois. He's actually scheduled for euthanasia this afternoon, so he's not..." "Why?" She hesitated. "He's been aggressive with handlers. He's injured people. The board made a decision this morning, and we don't really... Can I see him?" The words came out before he'd processed the decision to say them. That bothered him, briefly. The fact that his mouth had moved independently of any conscious directive. He'd had that problem since the injury. His body still responded to things before his brain finished categorizing them. 17 years of SEAL training didn't uninstall itself just because your knee got shredded by an IED outside Kandahar. The girl was looking at him with an expression caught between protocols she'd been given and the specific awkwardness of saying no to a veteran with a cane. "Sir, it's really not. I'm not going to touch him. I just want to see him." A door opened at the end of the hall. The woman who came through it, late 40s, dark circles under her eyes, the posture of someone carrying a decision she wasn't sure about, saw him and stopped. "Jennifer, what's—" "He wants to see Shadow." A long pause. The woman looked at Ethan. "I'm Megan Brooks. I run this facility." Ethan Mercer. "Mr. Mercer, the dog in our isolation corridor has injured 3 people, destroyed shelter property worth—" "I understand." "I don't think you do, with respect. He's not a dog that responds to—" "What's his collar?" She blinked. "What?" "His collar. What type is it?" He hadn't seen the dog yet. This was an inference, something about the rhythm of those impacts, something about Jennifer's description. High drive working background, his brain supplied. Previous handler, specific behavior pattern. Megan Brooks looked at him differently now. "It's a tactical collar, mold compatible. We couldn't get close enough to remove it." Ethan said nothing. He turned and looked down the hallway toward the door marked Authorized Personnel. 2 minutes, he said. "I'm not asking to go inside. I'll stand in the hall." Another pause. The kind that meant a decision being made that someone would probably regret or be grateful for, with no way to know which. 2 minutes, Megan said. The isolation corridor smelled like bleach over something older, damp concrete, animal fear, the specific flat odor of industrial disinfectant that never quite covers what it's meant to cover. The fluorescent lights were the buzzing kind, 2 of them slightly out of sync with each other, producing a flicker that was just below the threshold of what most people would consciously register, but enough to make your eyes feel tired after 30 seconds. Ethan walked it slowly. The cane clicked on the floor. Jennifer hung back near the door, arms folded. The last kennel was reinforced differently from the others. Heavier gauge wire, a steel plate added to the lower third of the door, where something had bent the original frame. The lights were better here, a working fluorescent without a flicker, and in that clean, bright light, Ethan could see him clearly. Shadow stood at the back of the kennel, not pacing, not vocalizing, standing with his weight balanced across all 4 feet, head level, yellow eyes tracking Ethan from the moment he'd rounded the corner. The tactical collar was visible, black webbing, double D-ring, a faded patch on the side that was too worn to read from this distance. The scar along his muzzle started at the left nostril and ran back almost to the cheekbone, the kind of scar that came from either a blade or shrapnel, nothing a domestic dog picked up in ordinary life. His body was lean in the way working dogs get when they've been eating kennel food for weeks. Not starving, but missing the muscle density that came from having a job. He was silent. Every muscle in his body was coiled at a low-grade readiness, not the explosive pre-attack tension Jennifer had described from the incidents, but something else. Something almost like a tension. The difference between a guard standing ready to repel an intruder and a soldier watching the door for a specific person. Ethan stopped 4 feet from the kennel. Shadow watched him. Ethan said nothing. He stood the way you stand when you've spent years in close-quarter spaces with other operators, and you learn that the first thing you put into a room is your energy, not your body. He let his shoulders drop. He breathed slowly. He didn't try to look dominant, didn't try to look submissive, just present, just there. 15 seconds. 30. Shadow's head dropped half an inch. The ridge of fur along his spine, which had been raised, settled. Ethan moved his cane to his left hand. With his right, slowly, he reached toward the collar patch and angled himself to read it in the fluorescent light. He squinted. The embroidery was almost entirely gone, but he could make out the shape. A specific design, a specific unit marker that he had seen before. His heart rate changed. "Don't jump. You're looking at a worn patch on a shelter dog. Don't..." But his hands were already moving, already going through the thing combat trained his body to do when something didn't add up. Process, catalog, cross-reference. The collar style. The strike pattern on the door. The assessment capability in those eyes. The scar line that angled exactly the way it would if... He looked at the microchip reader clipped to the kennel post. Standard unit, issued to every isolation kennel in case of incoming animals. He looked at Megan Brooks, who had followed at a distance. Has his chip been read? We tried. It came back corrupted. The system couldn't. What reader are you using? Standard Avid. You need a military ISO reader. Standard commercial readers can't decrypt the embedded data on military working dog chips. The encryption is different. The silence that followed lasted about 4 full seconds. Megan Brooks said very carefully, military working dog. That patch, Ethan pointed. I can only read part of it, but the design, that's a MARSOC K9 unit marker. And the way that chip reads corrupted on a commercial scanner is exactly what happens with MWD chips, because they use a dual-layer encoding that civilian readers interpret as a data error. He paused. This dog's not a stray. He has a file. Somewhere. Jennifer, from the back of the corridor. That's a big assumption from a worn-out... What's your euthanasia timeline? Ethan asked. Megan checked her watch. Her face did something complicated. 4 o'clock. He looked at her. That's 13 minutes, she said. Ethan's hand went to the phone in his jacket pocket. He had a number in that phone that he hadn't dialed in 2 years. A number attached to a name he hadn't spoken aloud since the funeral at Arlington. A service where a flag had been presented to a family he'd barely known, while he stood in his dress blues in the October cold with his legs still wrapped in bandaging under his trousers, and held himself together with the precise internal discipline that SEALs spent years building and never quite learned to turn off. He looked through the kennel mesh at the dog standing motionless in the clean fluorescent light. The dog looked back. And then, in the empty, disinfectant-scented corridor, with the rain hammering the roof and 12 minutes left on a clock, nobody wanted to watch. Shadow did something that none of them expected. He sat down. Not the anxious sit of an animal trying to appease a threat. The formal, square-hipped, military working dog sit. Spine straight, tail down, eyes forward. The position a dog holds when it recognizes the command authority of a handler. Jennifer made a small sound behind him. Megan put her hand over her mouth. Ethan Mercer stared at the dog for 3 seconds, then put the phone to his ear. It rang twice. A voice answered that he hadn't heard in 2 years. Flat, precise. The voice of a man who picked up unknown numbers because in his line of work, unknown numbers sometimes mattered. Mercer. Not a question, just his name, stated. Colonel. His voice came out steadier than he expected. I need you to run a military working dog ID. It's urgent. A pause. How urgent? He looked at the clock on the wall. 11 minutes. Another pause, shorter. What's the chip signature? Ethan turned to Megan. Chip number. She grabbed the failed scan printout from the kennel post. Read it off. He relayed it, then waited. In the kennel, Shadow hadn't moved. He sat in the formal position and watched Ethan's face with an expression that was not readable as anything a shelter worker would know how to categorize, but that Ethan, who had spent 8 years working alongside military K9 units in some of the ugliest terrain on Earth, recognized as something he had not expected to see again in any form, in any place, at any time in his life. Recognition. Colonel, he said quietly, while the phone static hummed and rain beat the roof, and Megan Brooks stood with the euthanasia order still folded in her coat pocket. Tell me you're finding something. The answer, when it came, hit him somewhere behind the sternum. Not hard, but deep. The way certain things land when you've been bracing for them for 2 years without knowing what you were bracing for. Mercer, the colonel said, where exactly are you standing right now? And Ethan, for the first time in longer than he could honestly remember, didn't have an answer that made any sense. The clock on the wall read 3:56. 4 minutes. The veterinarian's footsteps were already audible at the end of the hall. The footsteps got louder. Dr. Dave Parrish turned the corner into the isolation corridor with a stainless steel tray in both hands, the kind with a raised lip around the edge to keep things from sliding. On it, a capped syringe, a length of tourniquet tubing, a cotton swab in a sealed packet, an alcohol wipe. Everything clean, everything arranged. The tray of a man who had done this before and organized the tools the same way every time because routine was the only honest mercy in the work. He saw Ethan and stopped. Not dramatically, just the half-second pause of a person who expected an empty corridor and got a stranger with a cane instead. Megan. His voice was level but aimed. Who is this? His name is Ethan Mercer. He came in to look at dogs. At 3:56. Dave, we have a 4 o'clock hard close on this. I've got the board chair on text right now asking me to confirm. I know what time it is. Her voice went flat in a way that suggested she used that tone to end arguments, not start them. Parrish looked at Ethan the way doctors look at people who've interrupted a procedure, not with hostility exactly, but with the specific impatience of someone who has accepted a difficult task and wants to complete it cleanly and without complications. Sir, I don't know what Megan has told you, but the animal in that kennel is not adoptable. He's not rehabilitable by any reasonable— Hold on! Ethan had the phone pressed to his ear and one finger raised, not rudely, just the universal signal of someone on an important call. Parrish's expression tightened. From the phone, a keyboard. Male voices in the background, low and quick. Then the colonel again. Mercer, I'm running the chip ID through the AF Docs registry now. You just said Redstone Valley, that's Flathead County, Montana? Correct. And the animal is alive. For about 3 more minutes if I can't give these people a reason. A pause that felt longer than it was. Stand by. Ethan lowered the phone slightly, kept it live, and looked at Parrish. Can you give me 5 minutes? I cannot give you 5 minutes. I have a legal obligation and an insurance requirement and a board directive that specifically— Dave, Megan put her hand on his arm. Not gently, exactly, firmly. 5 minutes. Parrish looked at her hand, then at her face, then at Ethan, then at the kennel where Shadow had not moved from his formal sit. Something in the tableau seemed to bother him in a way he couldn't immediately articulate. The stillness of the dog, maybe. The posture. Belgian Malinois in shelter situations did not typically sit quietly while strangers stood 4 feet from their kennel. They lunged, they vocalizing, they threw themselves at barriers. This dog was sitting like he was waiting for roll call. 5 minutes, Parrish said. He didn't put the tray down. He held it and stepped to the side of the corridor and leaned against the wall, making it clear he wasn't leaving. Jennifer had produced a folding chair from somewhere and offered it to Ethan, who declined it. Standing felt necessary right now in a way he couldn't explain. Some old habit thing about not sitting when a situation was unresolved. Some seal-brained refusal to make himself small while things were in motion. His knee was grinding steadily, the cold of the corridor not helping, but he'd operated through worse and his body knew the difference between pain that mattered and pain that was just noise. He kept the phone to his ear. Shadow watched him from the kennel. The formal sit had not broken. The dog's yellow eyes tracked Ethan's face with a quality of focus that made Jennifer, standing near the corridor entrance, unconsciously take a half-step backward. Not because the dog looked aggressive, because he looked intelligent in a way that was slightly unnerving in an animal, the way it's unnerving when something is clearly processing more information than you can account for. The collar patch was still bothering Ethan. He'd been trying to read the secondary emblem. Below the main unit marker, there was something smaller, partially obscured by wear and what looked like dried adhesive from a removed additional patch. He stepped 1 foot closer to the kennel. Shadow tracked the movement but didn't shift his body. The secondary emblem was a number, or had been. The first digit was legible, a 1. The rest was gone. But the 1 was enough, combined with everything else, to put a cold weight in the center of his chest. Colonel, he said quietly, is there a K9 designation in the 1st MARSOC Battalion records that's listed as separated or lost in the last 3 years? Handler KIA, overseas, classified operation? A beat. Mercer, why are you asking me that specific question? Because I think I know what I'm looking at. Another beat, longer. That's a specific subset. I'm asking about Marcus. The name landed in the corridor like something dropped from a height. Megan heard the shift in Ethan's voice when he said it, the way certain words come out of certain people carrying weight that has nothing to do with their syllables. She didn't know who Marcus was. She didn't ask. Parrish checked his watch. 4 minutes, he said, to no one in particular. Dave, Megan said. I'm just noting the time, Megan, for the record. From the phone, more keyboard sounds. A male voice in the background saying something with urgency. Then the colonel, quieter than before. The AF Docs registry is showing a K9 designation linked to a 1st Marine Raider Battalion embedded element. Dog's working name was Ghost. Handler deceased, KIA, 14 months ago. The file is classified at the operational level, but the dog's status is listed as a pause. Missing, not deceased, missing. The word hit Ethan somewhere he didn't have good defenses for. Missing, not dead, not retired, not transferred to a new handler or returned to the training facility or any of the clean administrative outcomes the military preferred. Missing, which meant the chain of custody had broken, which meant Ghost had been somewhere out in the world for 14 months, moving through whatever had happened to him between a classified overseas location and Route 12 near the Flathead Reservation boundary in northern Montana, and nobody with the right equipment had been close enough to his microchip to read the dual-layer encoding and recognize what they were looking at. 9 weeks in a shelter. 14 months before that. Ethan's hand was tight on the phone. He made himself loosen it. "Colonel, I need you to contact the shelter director here with official military verification of the animal's identity. I need it in the next 3 minutes, or they're going to put him down." "Mercer, the file is classified. I can't just find a way." He kept his voice even. "Please." A pause, then, "Give me the shelter's main line." Ethan turned to Megan. She read off the number without being asked. She'd already pulled her phone out, already understood what he needed, which told him she was sharper under pressure than her tired exterior suggested. He relayed it, heard the colonel repeat it back. 2 minutes, Parrish said from the wall. He straightened up. He wasn't being cruel about it. His face was tired, not satisfied. But he'd been given an order and he'd accepted it, and he was going to follow it to the minute because that was the kind of man he was. "Dave." Ethan said his name directly for the first time. Parrish looked at him with moderate surprise. The surprise of someone addressed by a stranger who has correctly identified which handle to use. "What happens if that phone rings in the next 90 seconds? Parrish glanced at the desk phone mounted on the corridor wall. An old unit, landline, the kind that still had physical buttons and a red light that blinked for incoming calls. "What? If that phone rings, what's your protocol?" Parrish looked at Megan. Megan was looking at the phone. "If it's a legal hold order," she said slowly, "or a verified government authority requesting suspension of—" "It's not that simple," Parrish said. "The board has already—" The phone rang. One ring, red light, blinking. Nobody moved for a half second that felt architecturally solid. Megan crossed to it and picked it up. "Redstone Valley Animal Center, this is Megan Brooks." The corridor was quiet enough that Ethan could hear the voice on the other end. Not words, but the register and cadence of it. Military. Formal. Moving fast. Megan's face changed. Not dramatically, she was too controlled for that. But the set of her jaw shifted and her eyes went to Ethan and then away from him and then back, and she reached for the pen clipped to her coat pocket and said, "Can you spell the verification code, please?" She wrote it on the back of her hand because there was no paper immediately available, and she wasn't going to waste time looking for one. Then, "And the classification level is, yes, I understand. One moment." She put the call on hold, turned to Parrish. "Dave." "Megan, whatever that military verification, government authority. The dog in this kennel is an active status military working dog registered under a classified operational designation. We cannot proceed with euthanasia." She said it the way she signed things, with the specific flatness of someone who has made the decision and finished making it. "Put the tray down." Parrish stared at her. "Dave." "Put the tray down." He put it on the shelf above the hand-washing station. The capped syringe made a small sound against the metal. He folded his arms and looked at the middle distance and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. And because whatever he felt about the last 9 weeks and 3 incidents and the insurance premiums and the board directives, he was also a veterinarian who had gone into the field because he didn't want animals to suffer, and the math on that had just shifted. Megan went back to the phone, finished the call, hung up. The corridor was very quiet. Shadow was still sitting. The silence lasted about 40 seconds before Jennifer said, "So what does that mean for the dog?" Nobody answered immediately. Ethan was still looking at the kennel. Megan was looking at the verification code on the back of her hand. Parrish was looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man recalculating several things at once. "It means," Ethan said, "that he's not yours to euthanize." "Then whose is he?" Ethan didn't answer that directly, because the honest answer was complicated in ways that would take longer than this corridor moment to explain, and because part of the honest answer was mine, which was something he hadn't expected to think when he drove through horizontal Montana rain to find a quiet, older dog on a therapist's orders. He moved closer to the kennel, not close enough to touch, 2 feet out. He lowered himself slightly, not a full crouch because his knee wouldn't take it, but enough to drop his eye line toward the dog's level. "Ghost," he said, low, flat. The way commands sounded in operational context, not theatrical, not emotional, just precise. The dog's ears shifted, not the cautious ear movement of an uncertain animal, the immediate vectored rotation of an animal that has recognized a specific sound pattern associated with a specific operational framework and is now waiting for the next input. Jennifer made a sound. She tried to make it quiet and didn't quite manage it. "Ghost," Ethan said again. "Sits." The dog was already sitting, but the command produced a visible reorganization of his posture, straighter, more deliberate, the formalized version of what had been an instinctive position. His tail, which had been still, moved once. Not wagging, just acknowledging. Parrish uncrossed his arms. Megan said quietly, "How do you know him?" "I don't, not personally." Ethan straightened up slowly, putting the weight back on the cane. "His handler was a friend of mine, a teammate. His name was Marcus Tron. He was a raider, Marine Special Operations 1st Battalion. He and Ghost did 3 tours together. Syria, Mali, one that I'm not going to name." He paused. "Marcus was killed 14 months ago during a direct action mission. I was in a VA surgical recovery room in Bethesda when it happened. I missed the funeral. I didn't—" He stopped, pressed his back teeth together briefly. "I didn't get the full debrief on what happened to the dog afterward. I assumed the unit handled it." "They didn't handle it," Megan said. "No, they didn't." She looked at the kennel, at Shadow, at Ghost, still sitting in his formal position, watching Ethan's face with those yellow eyes. 9 weeks of shelter logs, 3 handler incidents, 1 bent door frame, endless behavioral assessment forms. All of it sitting differently now, all of it reading differently in the light of what she'd just been told. "He injured 3 of my people," she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a fact she needed to put on the table. He was trained for combat environments and then left uncontrolled for over a year after his handler died. He doesn't have a framework for what he's in right now. Ethan said it without defensiveness. It's not aggression, it's protocol collapse. He doesn't have a command structure anymore, so everything looks like a threat. That's the same as dangerous. It's the same as broken. Those aren't identical. Megan looked at him for a long moment. She was doing the thing good administrators do when a situation has exceeded the existing rules, assessing the gap between the policy she'd been working from and the actual facts now in front of her, trying to figure out how much of her authority she could legitimately extend and how much would get her fired. "What do you want to do?" she said finally. It was a direct question, and it surprised him slightly with its directness. He'd expected more bureaucratic scaffolding before they got there. "I want to take him." Parrish. "You can't just—" "Dave." Megan again. Final tone Megan. "Go make some calls. The board needs to hear about the military verification before they hear about it from me." Parrish picked up his tray with its unused contents and left the corridor. His footsteps went quickly toward the front of the building, which suggested that despite everything, he also wanted this particular problem to have a solution that wasn't the one he'd walked in here to perform. Jennifer drifted closer. She was young, mid-20s, still at the age where her face showed everything. Right now it showed the specific expression of someone watching something that doesn't fit any category they were given. "How do you get a military working dog out of a shelter?" she asked. "Like, what's the process?" "The colonel is working on emergency transfer paperwork. It'll go through the Marine Corps Installation's East K9 office. They're the administrative authority for MARSOC working dogs. He'll have something formal in a couple of hours." Ethan looked at Megan. "I need permission to come back here tonight, or to wait." "You can wait," she said. "We have coffee. It's bad coffee." "That's fine." She nodded once, then looked at Ghost for a moment with an expression that was tired and complicated and something else that wasn't quite relief, but was adjacent to it. 9 weeks, she said quietly. Not to anyone. "We thought he was just—" She didn't finish it. Ethan didn't finish it for her either. He understood what the end of the sentence was. They had thought he was just a broken, dangerous animal that the world couldn't use, and he had been behaving like one. But the behavior and the truth of him were two different things, and the gap between them had almost been lethal. He sat in a plastic chair in the front office with a styrofoam cup of coffee that was, as advertised, genuinely terrible. Jennifer had given him a printout of Ghost's intake forms and behavioral assessment logs, and he read through them with the methodical attention he'd once applied to pre-mission intelligence packages, not looking for confirmation of anything, just reading for accuracy, trying to construct the picture from the outside in. The incident reports were consistent with what he knew about high-drive working dogs in handler loss situations. PTSD in military canines was documented and real, though the terminology the behavioral literature used was acute stress response and handler separation syndrome, which were more clinically defensible phrases that meant roughly the same thing. Ghost had lost Marcus in a violent operational context. There was no soft version of that, no transitional process, no grief counseling for a dog who'd been running a direct action mission with his handler one day and sitting in a Flathead County pound 6 weeks later without any of the structure, commands, or familiar human signatures that defined his entire existence. What came out as aggression was something more specific, a defense protocol running on nothing but instinct, no longer guided by a handler's commands, defaulting to the only output it had left when everything else had been stripped away. You couldn't fix that with a behavior assessment and a modification plan. You could only fix it with what it needed in the first place, someone who spoke the language. He turned a page. There was a handwritten note clipped to the back of the last incident report. Megan's handwriting. He'd matched it to the signatures on the forms. It said, "He's not vicious. I've been doing this for 6 years. He's not vicious. He's lost. There is a difference, and I am the only person in this building who seems to think it matters." Ethan read it twice. He set the forms down, picked up the terrible coffee. Outside, the rain had shifted from horizontal to merely heavy, which in Montana passed for improvement. His phone buzzed. The colonel. "The transfer paperwork is in process, expedited through the K9 office. You'll have something official by 2100 hours tonight. In the meantime," a pause. "Mercer, are you the right person for this animal?" The question was professionally worded but personally aimed. The colonel knew about Ethan's medical discharge. He knew about the surgical complications, the 8 months of physical rehabilitation, the involuntary exit from active duty that Ethan had never quite organized his identity around the outside of. He was asking a real question. "Probably not," Ethan said, "but I'm the person who's here." "That's not an answer." "It's the best one I have right now." A pause. "The dog is going to be difficult. The separation trauma alone, I know. You're living alone in a mountain cabin. I know that too. And your own—" The colonel stopped, recalibrated. "I'm trying to ask if you're stable enough for this." Ethan looked at the foam cup in his hand, the cabin, the whiskey bottles, the 12-day stretches without leaving. Dr. Chu's voice 3 weeks ago, "The trajectory here is very predictable." "No," he said, "but stable isn't the only variable." Another pause, longer this time. "I'll have the paperwork to you tonight. There will be a 30-day monitoring check-in requirement, military protocol for transferred MWDs. You'll need to log behavioral assessments. Understood? And Mercer." The colonel's voice shifted slightly, not softer exactly, but less formal. Marcus would have wanted him with someone who understood what he was. Ethan said nothing to that. There was nothing to say that wasn't too large for a phone conversation in a shelter waiting room. "Thank you, Colonel." He hung up, set the phone on his knee, looked at the wall for a moment, then at the hallway door, beyond which he could hear, faintly beneath the rain on the roof, no sounds from the isolation corridor. No impacts. No movement. Just silence. He thought about what that meant. He thought about a dog who'd been running combat missions in some desert he'd never get to name, with a man who'd shared exactly 3 cold beers with Ethan in a forward operating base in Mali in 2021, and described Ghost as the most serious individual I have ever met, and that includes everyone in this battalion. He thought about 14 months of whatever had happened between there and Route 12. He thought about 9 weeks of shelter logs and 3 handler incidents and a handwritten note that said, "He's not vicious. He's lost." He thought about his own cabin, the empty bottles, the 11 consecutive days he'd once spent without leaving and hadn't noticed until Dr. Chu asked him directly when he'd last been outside and he'd had to do actual math. He picked up the styrofoam cup and finished the terrible coffee. At 6:47 p.m., Megan came to find him. "Dave got through to the board chair," she said. "We have authorization to hold him pending the official transfer documentation. You're welcome to stay, but, Mr. Mercer, you should eat something. There's a diner on Route 12 about 2 miles north. They'll be open." "I'm fine. You've been sitting in that chair for 2.5 hours. "I'm aware." She looked at him with the direct, appraising look of a person who managed difficult situations for a living. "You knew the handler, the one who died." "Marcus, yeah." "Were you close?" "Close enough." A pause. He was the kind of person who made the people around him better at things. Competence was contagious when he was in the room. I never told him that. He was looking at the wall. "You don't really, when—" He stopped, shrugged once, the movement barely visible. "You figure there's time." Megan was quiet for a moment, then, "The dog in there. You think you can actually help him?" "I don't know." "Honest." It seemed like the right thing to say. She almost smiled. It was the first time all afternoon that her face had done that. "I've been in this work long enough to know that the right thing and the workable thing are not always the same animal. Neither are the wrong thing and the impossible thing." She looked at him. He shrugged again, the same small movement. It wasn't wisdom, exactly. It was just the particular philosophy of someone who'd made decisions in circumstances where the manual didn't cover the situation and learned to operate in the gap. At 9:14 p.m., the email came through from the K9 Administrative Office, CC'd to the Colonel, with 3 attachments and a formal military seal in the header. Megan printed it, read it, countersigned the shelter's portion of the transfer documentation with a ballpoint pen, the same pen she'd used earlier on a different document for a different purpose. Then she walked Ethan back to the isolation corridor for the second time that day. This time, she carried the key. The corridor was quieter at night. The flickering lights had been switched off, and only one functional unit remained lit, casting the hallway in a steadier, dimmer glow. The rain had finally slowed to something intermittent, and in the gaps between drops, the shelter had a different quality of silence. Not tense, the way it had been at 4 o'clock, but simply still. Ghost was lying down when they reached the kennel. Not the anxious lateral sprawl of a dog that had given up. The deliberate sphinx position, front paws forward, head level, watching the doorway with the patient attention of a sentry who had been told to hold position and intended to do exactly that. Megan fitted the key into the lock. It turned. She pulled the door open and stepped back, behind Ethan, because she was experienced enough to know when her presence was the variable that needed subtracting from the equation. Ethan stood in the open doorway. Ghost looked at him from across the kennel, 8 feet of concrete floor between them. The scar on his muzzle caught the light. His breathing was even and controlled. Ethan did not step forward. He waited. The thing about working dogs, the thing that took years to understand and that Marcus had explained once, quietly, over those 3 cold beers, was that trust wasn't something you installed. It was something they confirmed. They were always already assessing. You couldn't trick it, and you couldn't manufacture it. You could only be what you were and let them read it. So Ethan stood in this doorway and was what he was. A man with a damaged knee and a dead friend, in a cabin that had too many empty bottles and not enough reasons to leave it, standing in a shelter corridor at 9 o'clock at night in northern Montana, waiting for a dog that had been lost for 14 months to decide whether any of that was worth approaching. Ghost's ears came forward. Then he stood. Slowly, with the deliberate weight of an animal that didn't move without purpose. He crossed the 8 feet of concrete in a straight line without hesitation and stopped directly in front of Ethan, close enough that his breath was warm against Ethan's hand. He pressed his forehead against Ethan's thigh, not the excited greeting press of a family pet, the specific, heavy stillness of one exhausted individual finding a surface solid enough to rest against. He pressed his head against Ethan's leg and held it there with all his weight, and the sound that came out of him was low and sustained and unlike anything any of the shelter staff had heard from him in 9 weeks. Not a whine, not a bark, but the specific, involuntary, helpless sound of an animal that has been holding something together through sheer effort and has finally encountered something solid enough to stop. Ethan's hand came down on the back of his head. He didn't say anything. Behind him in the corridor, Jennifer was crying quietly and pretending not to be. Megan was not crying, but her hand was pressed flat against the corridor wall, and she was looking at the floor. They stood like that for a while, just the two of them in the lit kennel, while the rain ran down the shelter roof and dripped from the gutters into puddles in the gravel outside, and the case of the most dangerous dog in Redstone Valley quietly rearranged itself into something else entirely. The ride home was quiet. Ghost sat in the back seat with his head resting on the center console near Ethan's right arm. The headlights picked out the rain-slicked asphalt of Route 12 heading north, the dark wall of pine on either side, the occasional reflective flash of a road marker. Ethan drove with the window cracked, cold air and the smell of wet pine and the sound of the dog breathing. 14 months, 3 countries probably, if the operational log he'd never be cleared to read went the way those operations typically went. 6 weeks in county impound before Redstone Valley took him. 9 weeks in isolation. The math of it sat in Ethan's chest without organizing itself into anything manageable. The cabin came into view around mile marker 31. The single window lit by the lamp he'd left on, the woodpile under its tarp on the porch, the small outbuilding he'd never gotten around to converting to anything useful. It looked the way it always looked, functional and solitary and aggressively devoid of anything that wasn't strictly necessary. He pulled into the gravel drive and cut the engine. Sat for a moment. Ghost lifted his head from the console and looked at the cabin through the windshield with yellow eyes that cataloged it the way he cataloged everything, systematically, without expression, processing information at a speed that was still unsettling to watch. "It's not much," Ethan said. Ghost glanced at him. "I know. I'm aware." He got out. Let Ghost out from the rear door. The dog hit the gravel and immediately went into a careful perimeter sweep. Not frantic or unfocused, but the deliberate, systematic scan of a working dog clearing an unfamiliar space, nose at gravel level, then up, then moving. He covered the perimeter of the cabin in under 3 minutes, including a pass around the outbuilding and a careful investigation of the woodpile. Then he came back to where Ethan was standing on the porch and sat, reporting all clear to the only authority structure he currently recognized. Ethan looked down at him for a moment. Then he unlocked the door and went inside, and Ghost followed without being asked, and the door closed behind them both. The kitchen smelled like wood smoke and, faintly, like the whiskey that had lived on the counter for the last 4 months. 3 bottles. He hadn't touched them in 2 weeks. Progress, by some measures. An ongoing problem, by others. He stood in the kitchen and looked at the bottles for a moment. Ghost sat in the middle of the kitchen floor and looked at him. Something in that, the dog just sitting there, watching him, waiting, reading him with those operational yellow eyes, made Ethan reach under the cabinet and pull out the recycling bin. He put the first bottle in, then the second, the third. The sound of glass in the bin was louder than he expected in the small kitchen. Ghost didn't react to the noise, he just kept watching. "Yeah," Ethan said. "I know." He filled a bowl with water and set it on the floor. Dug a bag of high-protein kibble from the shelf where he'd stopped at the gas station outside Redstone. He'd bought it on instinct before he knew what the night would produce, which was either optimism or something else entirely, and filled a second bowl. Ghost ate with the focused efficiency of a working dog, without excitement, without rushing, clearing the bowl completely, and then stepping back. Ethan made himself a sandwich he didn't particularly want and ate it standing at the counter. The rain had picked up again outside. The window over the sink showed nothing but black glass and rain tracks. He thought about Marcus. Not the version of Marcus from the last time he'd seen him. At that forward operating base, the cold beers, the specific dry humor Marcus had used to deflate tension in any room, but the earlier version. Mali, 2019. Ethan's second deployment overlapping with Marcus's first K9 integration assignment. Ghost had been 2 years old then, just out of training, and Marcus had described the dog's assessment process with something close to affection. "He's running threat assessments constantly," he'd said. "You can see him doing it, like watching someone read really fast." Ghost was doing it right now, standing near the front door, cataloging the cabin with slow, methodical attention sweeps. Ethan watched him and thought about trajectories, about the colonel's question on the phone, "Are you stable enough for this?" About the honest answer he'd given, which was no, But that stability wasn't the only variable. He didn't know what the other variables were exactly. Not yet. He just knew that the cabin felt different with something else in it, not better in any way he could cleanly define, just different. The quality of the silence had changed. That was something. It was after midnight when Ethan finally went to the bedroom. He hadn't slept a full night in longer than he could reliably reconstruct. The nightmares came at different hours and different intensities, and the whiskey had been the only thing that pushed them back far enough to get 4 or 5 hours, which he'd known for a long time was not a sustainable system, and had continued anyway, because the alternative was lying awake listening to the dark do its worst. He sat on the edge of the bed, still dressed. The lamp on the nightstand cast a yellow pool on the floor. Ghost appeared in the doorway, stood there. "No," Ethan said. Ghost looked at the bed. "You're a military working dog. You sleep on the floor." Ghost looked at him. "I'm serious." Ghost crossed the room and stepped onto the end of the bed with the specific, deliberate weight of an animal who had made a tactical decision and was implementing it. Ethan rubbed his face. "That's okay, fine." He pulled off his boots, lay back against the pillow, pulled the blanket up partially. Ghost settled across his legs, 70-some pounds of compact muscle and dense bone, warm and heavy and real. The lamp clicked off. The rain on the roof was steady. Ethan lay in the dark and waited for the nightmares to start. They didn't. Not that night. He was asleep inside of 20 minutes, which was not something he could explain and didn't try to. And Ghost lay across his legs like an anchor and breathed slow and even in the dark. And outside, the Montana rain kept falling on the pines, on the gravel, on the empty road back to a shelter that had almost made an irreversible mistake at 4 o'clock that afternoon. Both of them slept. It was not a cure. It was not a resolution. It was one night, in one cabin, after one of the more improbable afternoons either of them had survived. But it was the first night in a long time that neither of them had to survive alone. The second night was harder. Ethan had known it would be. One good night didn't rewire anything. It just proved the wiring could still conduct something other than damage, which was useful information, but not a solution. He'd learned that in Bethesda, in the hospital, when the first day he walked the corridor without the wheelchair had felt like a beginning, and the second day his knee had swollen to the size of a softball, and he'd spent 4 hours in a chair by the window, watching the parking lot and reconstructing every decision he'd made in the 12 seconds before the IED detonated, looking for the one he could have changed. There wasn't one. He'd known that then, and he knew it now. Knowing it didn't stop the reconstruction. The nightmare that came at 2 a.m. on the second night was the specific one. Not the explosion, not the White Hospital ceiling, but the one set in the dust-colored courtyard outside a building he'd never been cleared to name in a country he was not supposed to have been in, with Marcus on his left and Ghost ranging ahead and everything going exactly according to the plan right up until the moment it didn't. In the dream, the moment stretched. The radio traffic compressed into a single long tone. Marcus turned to say something and Ethan couldn't hear it. And then the light changed and Marcus was gone and Ghost was gone, and Ethan was alone in the courtyard with the long radio tone and the changed light and nothing else. He woke with his hand on the nightstand lamp before he was conscious of reaching for it. The light came on. Ghost was already standing on the bed, not barking, not moving, standing with his weight shifted forward, watching Ethan's face with the focused assessment that Ethan was starting to understand was his default state, the mode he ran in the way other dogs ran in idle, reading, cataloging, processing. Ethan sat up, put both feet on the floor. The knee cracked. "I'm fine," he said. Ghost stepped off the bed and sat beside his right leg. The contact was deliberate, shoulder pressed against Ethan's calf, and he held it there, steady weight against the muscle, the same way he'd pressed his head against Ethan's thigh in the shelter corridor. Ethan looked at the wall for a while. The nightmare didn't go back to sleep when he did, but it retreated to the edges, and in the space it left, he lay in the dark with Ghost's warmth against his legs, and thought about the colonel's paperwork, about the 30-day assessment requirement, about the behavioral log he was supposed to maintain. He thought about practical things until he was asleep again, and the practical things blurred into something slower and less specific, and finally just stopped. He woke at 6:15 to Ghost standing at the bedroom door, ready to work. The first 2 weeks were not a movie. That was the thing nobody was going to put in any account of what happened, but it was the most accurate thing about it. The first 2 weeks were tedious and difficult, and occasionally dangerous, and were composed mainly of the same small problems repeating themselves with minor variations, which was how rehabilitation actually worked for both humans and animals, but which was profoundly uncinematic and would not hold anyone's attention if described in real time. Ghost had triggers. That was the clinical word, and it was also the accurate one. Gunshot sounds, which in rural Montana were not infrequent, because hunting season had started and the ridge above the cabin produced a rifle crack every other morning that carried clearly in the cold air. The first time it happened, on day 3, Ghost went from a disciplined heel position to a flat crouch in the gravel within the span of a single second, head down, eyes scanning the tree line, every muscle in his body vibrating with the effort of holding position against an instinct that wanted to do something faster and more decisive. He held it for 45 seconds, which was a long time, Ethan understood. A very long time to hold a working dog in command, when every instinct was firing. And then the shaking started. Ethan had seen combat stress responses in human operators. The signs were different across bodies, but the underlying mechanism was the same. The nervous system had been trained to run at maximum capacity in specific threat contexts, and when those contexts reappeared in altered form, the system kicked on regardless of whether the threat was real. Ghost's system was kicking on. His system was also, simultaneously, trying to hold the command it had been given. The shaking was what happened when those two things ran at the same time. Ethan crouched down, the knee screaming, and put his hand flat on the dog's side. Blibe. Stay. Low. Even. Ghost's breathing was rapid and shallow. His eyes were still on the tree line. Blab, Ethan said again. Same tone. No urgency in it. Just the word. The rifle cracked again from the ridge. Ghost flinched, but held. The shaking intensified for 10 seconds, and then began, degree by degree, to subside. Gut, Ethan said. Good. And meant it. They stayed in the crouch for another 2 minutes. Ethan's knee made several noises it shouldn't have. He ignored them. When Ghost's breathing came back to something approaching normal, Ethan stood, and they continued the walk. And neither of them made any particular event of what had just happened. That was day 3. Day 5 was the chain link fence near the logging road. Ghost had stopped dead in front of it, and Ethan had watched him realize, slowly, that it was not what his system had initially categorized it as. Day 8 was the truck backfiring on Route 12 when they were running a late afternoon perimeter check of the property. Day 11 was harder. Ethan had knocked a cast iron skillet off the stove while making dinner, and the sound had sent Ghost into a full tactical crouch under the kitchen table with his lips pulled back, and it had taken 12 minutes and careful, deliberate de-escalation before he came out. Ethan wrote all of it in the behavioral log. Trigger, response, duration, de-escalation method, outcome. The Marine Corps K-9 office had sent a template, and he used it without modification. The colonel called at the end of week 1, and Ethan read the summary to him over the phone without editorializing. That's consistent with what they'd expect, the colonel said. What about your own situation? I'm fine. That's not what I asked. Ethan paused. The nights are better. The colonel didn't say anything to that. He'd known Ethan for 9 years. He understood the specific weight of better as a data point from Ethan Mercer, which was that it was honest and that it was relative, and that it meant something real in both of those dimensions. Keep the log, he said. I will. And Mercer, call Dr. Chu. He already had. That was the other thing about the first 2 weeks. Dr. Chu's schedule had opened up to twice a week, which she'd suggested and he'd agreed to without the usual resistance. He'd driven to Kalispell on the 3rd Wednesday with Ghost in the back seat, and Ghost had sat in the waiting area outside her office with the formal patience of an animal trained for exactly this context, which he was, in a sense, since medical assistance program integration was part of the MARSOC K-9 curriculum, and Ghost had been through it. The receptionist had tried to make a fuss about the dog's presence, and Ghost had looked at her with such complete professional neutrality that she'd stopped mid-sentence and just nodded. In the session, Ethan had told Dr. Chu about the courtyard dream. He told her about the 11-minute collar assessment in the shelter corridor. He told her about the whiskey bottles in the recycling bin. She'd listened to all of it without writing anything down, which was her method. She only wrote during the last 5 minutes, which she described as the part where things had settled enough to see their shape. Then she'd said, "How does it feel to be responsible for something? Exhausting." And a pause. Necessary. She'd written that down. On the 17th day, they had a problem. It came from a direction Ethan hadn't anticipated, which was the County Animal Control Office. A man named Bryce Dalton had been leaving phone messages at Redstone Valley since the week of Ghost's transfer, which Megan had fielded and which she'd mentioned to Ethan once in passing with the careful tone of someone who wanted to inform him without alarming him. Dalton was a county supervisor with partial oversight authority over the animal control budget, and his position on the Shadow situation, he consistently used that name, not Ghost, which Ethan found he had specific feelings about, was that the military transfer paperwork was procedurally irregular, and that a dog with documented injury incidents should not be placed with a private individual without a formal review process that included his office. The messages had been polite, then professionally firm. Then, on day 17, Dalton appeared in person at Ethan's cabin. He came in a county SUV with his name and title on a business card, and the specific energy of a man who had prepared his argument in the truck on the way over and was confident in it. He was 50-something, heavy-set, the kind of sunburn that came from years of outdoor county work in Montana, and he wore his authority the way some men wore new boots, a little stiff, a little deliberate. Ethan opened the door before Dalton knocked. Ghost was at heel, which was where he'd been since the SUV turned into the gravel drive. Dalton looked at Ghost. Something in his expression shifted. "Mr. Mercer." He held up the business card. "Bryce Dalton, Flathead County Animal Services Oversight. I know who you are." Ethan didn't take the card. "What do you need?" "A beat." Dalton recalibrated slightly. "I'd like to discuss the placement of the animal you have there. Given the incident history at Redstone Valley, there are liability concerns that my office has an obligation to. The transfer was authorized by the United States Marine Corps. The paperwork is registered with the K-9 Administrative Office and has been filed with the State Veterinary Board." Ethan said it the way he'd once given sit-rep summaries, organized, without padding, leaving no gap for interruption. "What specific procedural question does your office have that isn't addressed in those filings?" Dalton looked at him for a moment. "The incidents at the shelter are documented, assessed, and explained in the behavioral analysis I submitted with the transfer application. Is there a specific incident you'd like to discuss?" "Mr. Mercer, I'm not here to—" "Then what are you here for?" The question landed flat and direct and without hostility, which was, Ethan had learned in 17 years of professional situations where hostility would have been counterproductive, more effective than anger. Dalton's face did something complicated. "The animal injured 3 shelter staff members," he said. "I have a legal obligation to ensure that the placement is appropriate and that public safety—" "Ghost," Ethan said. Dalton stopped. Ghost, who had been in a perfect heel position since the door opened, executed a precise 90-degree left turn, moved to the porch railing, and sat facing outward, on command, cleanly, immediately. The silence that followed was the particular kind that happens when someone has said something without using words. "Public safety," Ethan said, in the same even tone. "He's a United States Marine Corps working dog with 8 years of service and 3 combat deployments. The behavioral issues at the shelter were consistent with handler separation trauma in an uncontrolled environment. He's now in a controlled environment with a handler who has the appropriate training background. That's documented in the transfer file." He paused. "Is there something else?" Dalton was looking at Ghost at the railing. The precision of the movement had done what precision always did to people who hadn't expected it. It had shifted the frame they'd arrived with. He'd come to the cabin to find a dangerous dog improperly placed. He'd found a military working dog executing commands with the exactness of a much younger animal, despite 14 months of trauma and 9 weeks of shelter isolation. "I still have an obligation to conduct a welfare check," Dalton said. He'd adjusted his approach. The legal framing was still there, but the confidence behind it had modified. "That's within my authority regardless of the transfer documentation." "I'm not disputing your authority to conduct a welfare check," Ethan said. "Come in." He stepped back from the door. Dalton hesitated. This was not how he'd expected the conversation to go. And then came inside. The cabin was clean. It was not organized in the way of someone who'd cleaned before a visit. It was organized in the way of someone who had recently applied discipline to their own space, the same way they were applying it to everything else. The recycling bin, visible from the door, had the bottles in it. The behavioral log binder was on the kitchen table, open to the current week. The food bowls were clean, the water was fresh. Ghost came inside behind Dalton without being called, positioning himself at Ethan's left with the natural ease of a dog who had found his place in a structure and occupied it without drama. Dalton looked around the cabin, looked at the binder, looked at the dog. "That's the assessment log," Ethan said. "Behavioral. You're welcome to review it. There's a copy on file with the K9 office." Dalton picked up the binder, read the first page, then the second. His expression was the expression of someone whose prepared argument is encountering friction from reality. He put it down. "How long have you had him?" 17 days. "And the commands? How long did that take?" He already knew them. He just needed the structure reestablished. Dalton looked at Ghost, who was sitting at Ethan's side and paying Dalton the specific quality of attention that working dogs paid to unknown individuals. Thorough, neutral, without hostility. "He's not what I expected," Dalton said finally. "No, he usually isn't." Dalton put his business card on the kitchen table without comment and left 7 minutes later. He came back 3 weeks after that with a different posture and a county form requiring a 6-month welfare check, which Ethan signed and returned the same day. That was the last they saw of Bryce Dalton. The morning the thing happened, the real thing, the thing that cracked both of them open in a way that no amount of behavioral logging or tactical de-escalation could have predicted or prepared, was in the 4th week on a Tuesday, when the air had turned genuinely cold and the aspens on the lower ridge had gone yellow. Ethan had been running a trail assessment with Ghost for about 40 minutes, which was the formal term he used in the log for what was actually just walking in the woods together, which was what Dr. Chu had been asking him to do more of, and which he'd found, grudgingly, was doing something useful for both of them. The trail looped up past a series of rock outcroppings, and came back down through a stand of pines that always smelled different from the aspens, sharper. And there was a specific point on the descent where you could see the cabin roof through the trees and the mountains beyond it. And if you stopped there and paid attention to nothing in particular, it was possible to feel something close to what he understood was called peace, though that word had been so far outside his operational vocabulary for so long that he used it cautiously and only in his own head. Ghost was ranging about 20 feet ahead. Not on leash. They'd reached the off-leash phase in week 3, and Ghost's recall was exactly what his training record said it was, which was impeccable. He was moving with the particular loose but controlled energy of a working dog on a low-alert perimeter sweep, nose working constantly, ears rotating. Ethan heard the sound before Ghost reacted to it, a child's voice. Somewhere off the main trail, down the slope to the left, in the pine stand below the rock outcropping. High and thin and frightened, calling out at irregular intervals. Not a scream, but the specific repeated calling of someone who doesn't know if they're being heard and is pacing their energy accordingly. Ghost had already stopped, head up, body still, ears fixed on a compass bearing below and left. "Ghost." Ethan kept his voice level. "Such." The German command for search. Ghost's head snapped toward him. A confirmation exchange, handler verifying the command. And then he was moving, off the trail and down the slope through the underbrush without sound, his body low and quick between the trees. Ethan followed as fast as his knee would let him. That was not fast. The slope was loose shale under pine needles, and the cane was not designed for lateral descent on rough terrain, which he'd known and had been managing through careful route selection for 4 weeks. Right now, route selection was not available. He went down the slope at an angle, planting the cane across the slope instead of downhill, checking each step before committing weight. The knee screamed. He kept moving. The child's voice got clearer. A girl, young, maybe 7 or 8, and the specific rhythm of the calls had changed to something more urgent, which meant she'd heard movement and didn't know what was coming. "Hey!" Ethan called out when he was still 30 feet above the pine stand, loud enough to carry. "My name is Ethan. I'm coming toward you. I have a dog. He's safe." The calling stopped. Then, "I'm stuck." He got through the tree line and found her in under a minute, which was because Ghost had already found her and was sitting 5 feet from her, with the specific non-threatening stillness of a dog who understands that the objective is proximity without alarm, letting her see him and adjust before closing the distance. She was 7, she told him later. Her name was Callie Nordstrom. She had gone off the marked trail to chase what she thought was a deer and had gotten her boot wedged between 2 rocks at the base of an outcropping and had been there for approximately 40 minutes. The boot was deeply wedged. The rock had a specific pinching angle that had taken her weight when she stepped wrong and then held when she tried to pull back. She had not panicked. She was crying, quietly, in the specific way of a child who has been scared for a long time and is now at the level of exhausted rather than acute. Ghost had moved close while Ethan was still working his way through the rocks. He was sitting beside her, not touching, just present, and she had her hand on the back of his neck and was breathing more slowly than when they'd arrived. Ethan assessed the boot situation. Serious. The angle was bad and pulling would hurt her and risk twisting the ankle if done wrong. Callie, I'm going to get your foot out. It's going to take a minute and I need you to hold still. Can you do that? Yes. Very small, very steady. Ghost, stay. Ghost didn't move. Ethan got down, both knees now, which was a specific kind of bad, and which he set aside as a problem for after, and looked at the rock angle and the boot position and thought about it for a moment. He needed to decompress the wedge without rotating her ankle outward. He needed her weight off the foot entirely. He needed something to lever the upper rock slightly. His cane was aluminum. He looked at it. He wedged it horizontally into the upper gap of the rock cleft, not trying to lift, but to hold the upper pressure point fractionally outward. Callie, put your hands on my shoulders. I want you to use my weight to lift yourself up. Straight up, not forward. Like climbing? Exactly like climbing. Her hands came onto his shoulders. He felt her weight shift upward. She was small, maybe 50 pounds, and simultaneously used his right hand to rotate the heel of the boot slightly inward along the only axis that had clearance, and felt it give. The boot came free. She came forward, and he caught her with his left arm, and they both went backward onto the pine needles, which was graceless, and his cane clattered away, and his knee produced a sensation that he would later describe to Dr. Chu as significant, but Callie Nordstrom was upright and intact with both feet on the ground. Ghost moved in immediately and put his nose against her face with the focused efficiency of a dog running a health assessment, which is exactly what he was doing. Callie made a sound that was surprised and relieved and faintly delighted all at once. He's checking me, she said. Yeah, he does that. Is he a doctor dog? He's Ethan paused. He's been trained to help people, so kind of. He found his cane, got his feet under him. The knee told him specific things about the last 10 minutes that he acknowledged and filed under deal with later. He stood, looked at Callie, who had both arms around Ghost's neck now in a way that Ghost was permitting with the patient dignity of a working dog, who understood that certain physical contacts were within operational parameters. Are your parents on the main trail? Ethan asked. My mom, she doesn't know I went off. A pause. She's going to be really upset with me. Probably. Do you have your phone? She produced it from her jacket pocket. It was out of service range. The trail corridor was a dead zone for the nearest 2 cell towers. She looked at it with the expression of someone confirming a fear. My radio. Ethan unclipped the handheld from his belt. He'd started carrying it in week 2, old operational habit reactivated by having a reason to be outside consistently. He checked the county emergency channel frequency, which he'd programmed on day 1 because that was the kind of thing he did, and keyed the transmit button. Flathead County Emergency Services, this is a civilian at mile marker 4 on the Redstone Ridge Trail, north face. I have a lost juvenile, approximately 7 years old, named Callie Nordstrom, no injuries, parent believed to be on the main trail, requesting contact. Over. Static. Then a response. A dispatcher's voice, flat and professional. Copy that, civilian. We have an active search call from a Karen Nordstrom at the Redstone Ridge trailhead. Can you confirm child's condition? Ambulatory, no injuries, minor distress, resolving. Copy. Will relay to the mother. Can you bring the child to the main trail? Affirm. ETA approximately 12 minutes. He reclipped the radio. Callie was looking at him with wide eyes. You have a radio? I do. Like the police. Something like that. Are you a policeman? No. She looked at Ghost. Is he? He's a Marine. She considered this with the serious attention of a child who is deciding whether to accept information at face value. Then she nodded. Okay. She took hold of Ghost's harness strap, not pulling, just holding, the instinctive grip of a child who has found something solid. Can he walk with me? He can walk with you. They went back up the slope. It was slow. Callie was shaky on her freed ankle, and the terrain was uneven, and Ethan's knee had moved past screaming into a quieter, more total form of complaint. Ghost matched their pace exactly, unhurried, keeping himself against Callie's left side as naturally as if he'd been trained for the specific purpose of steadying a frightened child on a rocky slope, which in some operational generalization of his training, he had been. They reached the main trail in 14 minutes. Karen Nordstrom was already there, a county search and rescue volunteer behind her, her face doing the specific transformation of a parent who has been scared for an hour and has just seen her child alive and unharmed. That particular collapse of held togetherness that is not weakness, but its opposite. She covered the distance in about 3 strides and had Callie in both arms before Ethan was fully on the main trail. Over her daughter's head, she looked at him, at the cane, at the torn pine needles on his jacket, at Ghost sitting calmly at his side. And her expression did the thing that expressions do when words are insufficient and the body says it instead. Your dog found her, she managed. He found her first. Callie, from inside the hug, he's a Marine. Karen Nordstrom looked at Ghost, then at Ethan. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The search and rescue volunteer, a young man with a county vest and a radio of his own, finished his paperwork quickly and left them. The trail was quiet in the mid-morning, aspens rattling their yellow leaves in the light wind off the ridge. Ethan stood on the trail for a moment after they'd gone. His knee was a specific kind of awful, and he was going to need ice and elevation, and probably a call to the VA physical therapy line he'd been ignoring for 6 weeks. The cane had a new dent in it from the rock lever. Ghost sat beside him. Good boy, Ethan said. It was not a sufficient statement for what had just happened. He knew that. But working dogs operated in a language of clear commands and direct acknowledgments, and Ghost had been running on the right version of himself for the last 40 minutes. Focused, precise, purposeful. The self that had spent 8 years being built in training facilities and deployed in operational environments that only a handful of people knew about. That self had been intact the entire time, waiting under the shelter logs and the behavioral assessments and the incident reports and the 9 weeks of isolation, waiting for the framework that let it run. Ethan looked at him for a moment, then he said quietly, to the trees and the cold air and nobody in particular. Marcus built you right. Ghost's ears moved. He looked up at Ethan with those yellow eyes and held the contact for a long moment, in the way dogs do when they are paying attention with their whole body. Then he looked back at the trail ahead, ready for whatever came next, in the way that things built for purpose are always ready. Not because they have no damage in them, but because the purpose is bigger than the damage. And they have found, after everything, that the purpose still fits. Ethan put weight on the cane, adjusted his grip, and started down the trail toward the cabin. Ghost fell in at heel. The aspens rattled yellow overhead, and the mountains held their cold blue position on the horizon, and the radio on Ethan's belt clicked once with a brief piece of dispatcher traffic that resolved into static, and the trail was quiet again, and they walked home. The ice pack lasted 20 minutes before it soaked through the dish towel and started dripping on the floor. Ethan didn't move to replace it. I was sitting in the kitchen chair with his leg elevated on the second chair and the behavioral log open on the table in front of him, and a pen in his hand that he hadn't used in the last 15 minutes. Ghost was on the floor near the door in the Sphinx position, front paws forward, monitoring the room with the patient attention of an animal that had decided this location was adequate and saw no reason to change it. The knee was bad. Not surgical bad. He'd been surgical bad and knew exactly what that felt like, which was a specific white-edged quality of pain that announced structural damage rather than muscle complaint. This was muscular. Tendon, probably. The rock slope and the leverage work with the cane and the uneven terrain of the return trail had stressed the repair work in ways that the VA physical therapist had specifically told him to avoid and that he had specifically avoided for 6 weeks and then not avoided today. He picked up the pen and wrote in the log. Day 28. Off-trail response, north face Redstone Ridge. Ghost executed search command, located juvenile, maintain non-threatening proximity protocol. Duration approximately 40 minutes. No behavioral incidents. Animal performed within full operational parameters. He put the pen down, looked at what he'd written, added, in smaller handwriting below, first full deployment level task performance since acquisition. No hesitation on command, recall, clean, judgment sound. He closed the log. Outside, the afternoon had gone fully cold, the kind that arrived in late October in the mountains without apology and intended to stay. The aspen color would peak this week and then drop within days. That was how it worked here, peak to bare in under a week. The leaves not falling individually, but going in sudden masses when the first serious wind came through. He'd watched it happen last year from the cabin window with a whiskey in his hand and hadn't thought much about it either way. His phone buzzed on the table. Unknown number, Montana area code. He almost didn't answer. He answered. Mr. Mercer. A woman's voice, composed, professional, with the specific economy of someone who was making a call they'd thought about. My name is Karen Nordstrom. You helped my daughter today. I know who you are. A brief pause. I got your number from the county search and rescue coordinator. I hope that's okay. It's fine. I wanted to... Callie hasn't stopped talking about your dog. About Ghost. She stopped. He could hear her composing herself. She was up there for 40 minutes before you found her. I was on that trail for 40 minutes, not knowing where she was, and another stop. I'm sorry. I had a whole thing I was going to say, and it's kind of gone. You don't need to say anything. I know. I wanted to anyway. A pause. She said he sat with her the whole time. She said he made her feel like someone was there. Ethan looked at Ghost across the kitchen floor. That's what he does, he said. After he hung up, he sat for another few minutes with the phone in his hand. Ghost had not moved. The ice pack had finished dripping and was now just a wet towel on his knee. The phone buzzed again. This time it was the colonel. Bassem. I heard about the trail incident, the colonel said. Fast. County emergency channels. The SAR coordinator filed a report that mentioned a civilian with a military working dog. It got flagged. A pause. How's the knee? Knee. Functional. Meaning I'm not in an emergency room. Mercer. It's tendon stress. I'll call PT tomorrow. You'll call PT tonight. He didn't argue. He'd learned over 9 years which battles with the colonel were worth having and which were not. And the ones involving his own physical maintenance were uniformly not worth having because the colonel was invariably right about them, and Ethan's instinct to minimize his own damage was a documented and well-established liability. The reason I'm calling, the colonel said, shifting tone in the specific way that meant transitioning from personal to operational, is that the K9 office had a meeting this morning about Ghost's status. Ethan's attention sharpened. What kind of meeting? Review board, standard 30-day assessment trigger. They've looked at the behavioral logs you submitted, the welfare check documentation, the Dalton County oversight resolution. A pause. And now this trail incident is going to be in the picture. What's the board's position? Mixed. The colonel said it cleanly, which meant it was more complicated than that word suggested, but that he was giving Ethan the navigable version. There's a faction that wants Ghost returned to a formal MWD placement. Training facility, reassignment to an active unit. They argue that the trail incident demonstrates he has full operational capacity and that placing an asset of that capability with a, he paused, choosing the word, with a medically separated individual in a private residential setting is an underutilization of a military resource. The sentence landed in the kitchen with a particular weight. Ethan was quiet for a moment. And the other faction, he said. The other faction points to the handler separation trauma history, the behavioral log progression, the stable placement indicators. They argue that reassigning him now would constitute a second disruption event and risk undoing the rehabilitation progress. Another pause. The review board wants you in Kalispell on Thursday, in person. For what? To make the case, if you want to make it. Ethan looked at Ghost. Ghost was looking back at him now, ears forward, reading the conversation from the tension in Ethan's body, the way he read everything, systematically, without assumptions, building the picture from available data. "What time Thursday?" Ethan said. 10:00. "I'll be there." He called Dr. Chu that evening from the porch, because the cabin felt too small for the conversation, and the cold air helped him think in the specific way it always had. Something about low temperatures and clarity of outline, the mountains going dark purple against a sky that was still faintly orange in the west. He told her about the review board. She listened without interrupting, which was her method, and when he finished, she said, "How do you feel about it?" "I feel like I need to prepare a case." "That's what you're going to do. I asked how you feel." He looked at the mountains. "I feel like the last 28 days have been the first 28 days in 2 years where I've had a reason to get up at the same time every morning that wasn't just discipline." He paused. "And I feel like that's probably a data point I shouldn't lead with in a military review board." "Probably not, but it's the true one." "The true one and the useful one aren't always—" "I know, you've said that." A brief pause. "Ethan, what does Ghost get from this arrangement that he couldn't get in a formal MWD placement?" He thought about it. The honest version. "Continuity. He's had 2 catastrophic disruptions. Losing Marcus, losing any controlled environment for 14 months. A 3rd reassignment into a new unit with new handlers, and a new command structure risks. I'm not asking about the clinical argument. I know the clinical argument. I'm asking what you actually think he gets." Ethan was quiet. "He gets someone who knew Marcus," he said finally. "Someone who understands what he came from. That's not in the clinical literature." He paused. "And I don't know if that matters to a dog. I don't know if he experiences it the way I'm describing it. But I know that when I said Marcus's name on day 1, something in him responded that wasn't about training." Dr. Chu was quiet for a moment. "Say that on Thursday." "To a military review board?" "Yes." "That's not how those conversations— You're not going in there as a former SEAL requesting a resource. You're going in there as the only person who can tell them what that dog actually needs. Those are different conversations." A pause. "You know how to read a room, Ethan. Read that one and decide when the clinical argument runs out and the honest one has to start." He stayed on the porch until it was fully dark, and the mountains were black shapes against a sky full of stars that the light pollution from Kalispell couldn't reach out here. Ghost had come to the door at some point and sat in the opening, half inside, half out, monitoring both spaces simultaneously. The very practical mind of a dog that understood that threats could come from any direction and saw no reason to choose. The Kalispell VA facility had a conference room on the 3rd floor that smelled like recycled air and the specific combination of institutional coffee and dry erase markers that Ethan associated with every formal military meeting he'd ever attended. The table was long, government-issue laminate. 5 people on one side, 1 empty chair on the other. He came in with Ghost at heel, which he had not cleared in advance and which produced a brief, visible recalibration among the panel members as he sat down. The panel consisted of Major Linda Voss, Marine Corps Installations East K-9 Administrative Officer, who had driven up from Missoula; Captain Reed Calloway, MARSOC Training Liaison, attending remotely on a laptop screen at the end of the table; Dr. Patricia Juan, VA-affiliated veterinary behavioral specialist; a civilian lawyer named Garrett, something whose role Ethan deduced was to represent the institutional liability interests of the Marine Corps; and the colonel, sitting at the far end with a legal pad he was not writing on. Voss ran the meeting. She was 40, precise, with the direct eye contact of someone who had learned to lead in environments where indirect communication was a luxury. She looked at Ghost without expression when Ethan sat down, then at Ethan. "Mr. Mercer, thank you for coming." "Major. For the record, this is an informal review board convened under Marine Corps Order 55585.2, governing the placement and transfer of retired and separated military working dogs. Your presence here is voluntary, and the board's findings are advisory rather than binding pending command review." She paused. "Do you understand that?" "I do." "You've submitted the behavioral assessment logs for the period of placement. The board has reviewed them." She opened a folder. "We've also reviewed the County Animal Control Welfare Check documentation, the shelter transfer file, and the incident report from Tuesday's trail event." A pause. "Captain Calloway, do you have preliminary remarks?" The laptop screen showed Calloway's face. Late 30s, the lean look of someone who ran 7 miles before work and thought everyone should. He had the expression of a man who had an opinion and had prepared it. I'll be direct. Ghost's performance profile during placement is consistent with full operational capacity. The trail incident specifically, search behavior, victim proximity protocol, handler direction response. These are Tier 1 K9 benchmarks. The behavioral log shows consistent and rapid rehabilitation from the trauma presentation at intake. My position is that an asset performing at this level should be evaluated for active unit reassignment rather than maintained in a private residential placement. Ethan looked at the laptop screen. "How many combat deployments have you done, Captain?" he said. "A beat. That's not... I'm asking a relevant question. How many?" Calloway's expression tightened. "2. Did you work with K9 integration on either?" No. My operational profile was... Then your read of what the behavioral log indicates is based on training doctrine and not operational experience. Ethan said it without heat. The trail incident looks like full operational capacity from a checklist perspective. From a handler perspective, what it looks like is a dog that performed well in a single low-intensity scenario with a trusted handler present. That's not the same data point. The benchmarks are designed for dogs without a 14-month uncontrolled separation event following handler KIA in a combat context. Ethan paused. Ghost training is intact. His operational capacity in a controlled environment with an established handler relationship is intact. His resilience to trauma triggers in a new handler, high-intensity, unfamiliar environment context, which is exactly what active unit reassignment would create, is not a dataset that currently exists. And the only way to get that dataset is to run the experiment on an animal that has been through 2 catastrophic disruptions already. The room was quiet for a moment. Dr. Juan spoke for the first time. She was 60, with reading glasses on a chain and the careful language of someone who published. "Mr. Mercer, the behavioral logs indicate 14 significant trigger events in the first 3 weeks. That number has dropped to 2 in week 4. Can you characterize what changed?" "Routine. Consistent command structure, predictable environment, and..." He paused. "He started having a job again. The trail monitoring, the property sweeps, the schedule. He stopped running on default defense protocol because there was something else to run on. And the trigger events that remain. Rifle cracks from the ridge, we're working on it. Systematic desensitization, gradual exposure at distance. It's slow." "How slow?" "As slow as it needs to be." Juan wrote something. Voss looked at the colonel, who had not spoken. The colonel looked at his legal pad. Garrett the lawyer cleared his throat. "Mr. Mercer, the Marine Corps has a legitimate interest in ensuring that military assets, including working animals, are utilized in ways consistent with their training investment. Ghost represents approximately $250,000 in training and operational development. The question the board is also obligated to consider is whether a private residential placement, regardless of its rehabilitative value, represents the appropriate long-term disposition for an asset of that caliber." Ethan looked at him. "You just called him an asset 3 times in 2 sentences. That's the institutional? He's not an asset. He's a working dog that lost his handler in a classified direct action mission and spent 14 months in conditions we don't have full documentation of before ending up in a shelter kennel in northern Montana 14 minutes from being euthanized." He said it evenly. "The Marine Corps had 14 months to locate him and didn't. I'm not saying that as a criticism. I understand operational security constraints and the administrative complexity of MWD tracking in classified contexts. But the institutional interest in Ghost's utilization was not sufficient to prevent his loss in the first place. That's relevant context for how much weight we should give it now." The lawyer wrote something on his pad. His expression was not quite what Ethan would call chastened, but it had adjusted. "Calloway, from the screen. Mr. Mercer, with respect, your own medical status is relevant here. You're a medically separated veteran with documented..." "Read." The colonel spoke for the first time. His voice was not loud, but it had a quality that filled the room the way certain sounds did. Not by volume, but by weight. Calloway stopped. "Finish that sentence carefully." A pause. "My point," Calloway said, in a modified register, is that the board should consider whether the placement handler has the long-term capacity to maintain the level of care and structure this animal requires. That's a fair question, Ethan said. He hadn't needed the colonel's intervention and appreciated it without showing it. My knee is currently stressed from a trail rescue operation, and I'll be in physical therapy starting tomorrow. My sleep quality, functional capacity, and overall behavioral stability over the last 28 days are documented in my own VA treatment records, which I've authorized the board to access. He paused. I'm not perfect. I have a damaged knee and I don't sleep well, and I lived in that cabin for 2 years, getting incrementally worse before this happened. Those are facts. He looked at Voss. Also facts. I haven't had a drink in 28 days. I've maintained a twice-weekly therapy schedule. I've kept an accurate and detailed behavioral log every single day. I got a medically discharged veteran's version of a busted knee down a shale slope because a child needed help and Ghost needed to work. And in 3.5 hours last Tuesday morning, your missing military working dog saved a 7-year-old girl and walked her home. He stopped. I'm the right person for this. The room was quiet. Ghost, who had been in a perfect downstay beside Ethan's chair since they sat, shifted his position slightly. Not standing, just adjusting his weight. A movement so small that only someone watching him carefully would notice it. But Voss noticed it, and the colonel noticed it, and Dr. Juan, who had spent 30 years assessing working dog behavior, noticed it and wrote something in her notes. Voss looked at the legal pad in front of her, then at Ghost, then at Ethan. I'm going to call a 10-minute recess, she said. Us. He stood in the hallway with Ghost and a cup of coffee from the floor's vending machine that was somehow worse than Megan Brooks's shelter coffee, which he had not believed was possible. Ghost sat beside him and watched the hallway with the patient attention of a dog who understood that waiting was part of the job. The colonel came out 2 minutes into the recess. He stood beside Ethan against the wall. Didn't say anything for a moment. He was a tall man, spare, with the kind of posture that came from 40 years of military bearing and didn't switch off when the uniform came off. Calloway wasn't wrong about your medical situation, he said finally. I know. I was wrong about everything else. I know that too. A pause. The lawyer is going to recommend a 12-month provisional placement with quarterly board reviews. Voss will probably accept it. Calloway will file a minority opinion that nobody will act on. And Juan wrote 3 pages of notes in a 40-minute meeting. She'll recommend continuation. She was watching Ghost the entire time you were talking, and she didn't look at anything else. He paused. That dog hasn't taken his eyes off you since we sat down. Ethan looked at Ghost. Ghost was looking at the hallway, doing his job. He takes his job seriously, Ethan said. He takes you seriously. The colonel said it simply. There's a difference. A longer pause. The hallway was quiet, just the hum of the ventilation system and the distant sound of a phone ringing somewhere in the building. Marcus talked about you, the colonel said, in his last evaluation debrief, before the mission. Ethan went still. He said, and this is a paraphrase because the exact wording is in a classified document, he said you were the best operator he'd ever worked alongside, and that the thing that made you good wasn't the training, it was that you took the work personally without letting it be personal. He said most people couldn't do both of those things at once. The ventilation hummed. He was wrong about some of that, Ethan said. Maybe. A pause. I wasn't wrong about all of it. The colonel went back into the conference room. Ethan stood in the hallway and drank the terrible vending machine coffee and thought about Marcus Trans saying something in a classified debrief that he would never be cleared to read, in a room he'd never been in, before a mission that had gone wrong in the specific way that certain missions went wrong. Not through error or negligence, but through the brutal mathematics of operational risk, where the numbers ran correctly and the outcome was still catastrophic. Ghost pressed his shoulder against Ethan's leg. Ethan looked down. Yeah, he said. I know. The board's preliminary finding came at 2:15 p.m. 12-month provisional continuation of current placement, quarterly behavioral reviews, mandatory handler health assessments, aligned with VA treatment schedule, full case documentation to be maintained and submitted monthly. Calloway's minority opinion was noted and filed. Dr. Juan's recommendation ran to 4 pages and included specific language about the rehabilitative value of handler continuity relationships in post-trauma MWD cases that Voss noted would be forwarded to the Canine Training Curriculum Review Committee. Voss walked Ethan to the elevator. Ghost walked at heel. "Off the record," she said, "Calloway's not a bad officer. He's just never watched a dog choose a handler." "What do you mean?" She nodded toward Ghost. "Working dogs don't choose. They're assigned. They bond to assignments, they perform for assignments, but the relationship is structured by us from the outside." She paused. "That animal has been making choices since you walked into that kennel. Shelter staff documented it. The sight, the response to your voice, the contact initiation. That's not training. That's something else." She looked at him directly. "I don't have clinical language for it, and I'm not going to pretend I do. But I saw it in there, and I saw it in the logs, and I made my decision accordingly." The elevator arrived. "Major," he stopped before stepping in. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Thank me. Keep the log current and call PT tonight, not tomorrow." She looked at his leg. She had probably been looking at the way he was favoring it since he walked in. "Tonight, Mercer." "Tonight." The elevator closed. He drove back to the cabin in the late afternoon, the mountains catching the last horizontal light in a way that turned the snow on the upper peaks copper and orange. Ghost rode in the back seat in his usual position, head over the center console, warm weight against Ethan's arm. They stopped at the gas station on Route 12 for fuel, and Ethan stood beside the truck in the cold air while the pump ran and looked at the mountains and thought about the word provisional. 12 months. Quarterly reviews. A structure that was not permanent but was real, which in his experience was how most worthwhile things started, not with certainty, but with enough framework to work inside of. He thought about Marcus in a classified debrief saying something about taking work personally without letting it be personal. He thought about how wrong and how right that was simultaneously, which was the kind of assessment Marcus had always been capable of, landing near the truth without quite completing it, because the full version was always more complicated than what could be said in a debrief. The pump clicked off. He got back in the truck. Ghost shifted in the back seat, resettling against the console. The cabin was 40 minutes north. The behavioral log needed a new entry. The VA physical therapy line needed a call. The monthly report for the K9 office needed a first draft. There was a lot to do. That was, he thought, the point. He put the truck in gear and pulled out onto Route 12 heading north, into the mountains and the copper evening light. And Ghost breathed steadily in the back seat, and the road unspooled ahead of them through the pines, and neither of them needed it to be anything other than what it was. A way home, with something to return to, on a day that had gone the only direction it could have gone, if you believed that showing up and making the case was sometimes enough. The mountains held their cold position on the horizon. The truck moved through the late light. Ghost slept. Chin kong mo rong noi dung. Show more. Ghost was still sleeping when they turned onto the gravel drive. That was new. In the first 2 weeks, he hadn't slept in the truck at all. Had ridden every drive in full alert posture, head up, scanning through the windows, running the same threat assessment loop he ran everywhere, until Ethan had started to wonder if the dog ever fully powered down. Somewhere around day 18 or 19, he'd started allowing himself to rest on longer drives. Not deeply, one ear always half-cocked, breathing that was slower but not entirely undefended, but rest. The kind of rest that only came when some layer of the nervous system had decided, provisionally, that the environment was not going to produce something that required immediate action. Provisional. Same word the board had used. Ethan cut the engine and sat for a moment in the quiet. The cabin window was lit by the lamp he'd left on. The woodpile was holding. He'd split 2 cords in October, which was more than he needed and which Dr. Chu had identified, accurately, as productive displacement activity, the kind of physical work that gave the body something to do while the mind processed things it wasn't ready to process directly. She hadn't told him to stop. She'd said, keep doing it, just notice what you're doing it instead of. He'd thought about that for a long time. Ghost lifted his head from the console. "We're home," Ethan said. He said it without thinking and registered it only after the word and the fact that it had come out naturally, without the slight internal friction that words carried when they didn't quite fit the reality they were describing. For 2 years, the cabin had been a location, a place he returned to because it was where his things were, and because the alternative was somewhere more public, which required more performance than he had available. It had not been home in the way that word meant something. He got out, let Ghost out, stood in the cold gravel while Ghost ran his perimeter check. Upper right quadrant, lower left, woodpile, outbuilding, full sweep, sut, and watched him do it and felt the particular quiet of a late Thursday evening in late October in northern Montana settle over everything, like the mountains settling into themselves at the end of the day. He called the VA physical therapy line from the porch. They had an opening Friday morning, which was either luck or the scheduling universe making a small correction for the 2 years he'd spent ignoring it. He took it, stood on the porch for another few minutes after hanging up, looking at the stars, which were the kind you only got at this elevation and this distance from anything electric. Dense and specific, the Milky Way visible as an actual structure rather than a suggestion. Ghost came to sit beside him. They stood there for a while, neither of them doing anything in particular. It was enough. Bob. November came in hard. The aspens had dropped their leaves in the windstorm Dr. Chu had predicted. And the ridges above the cabin went from copper to bare gray over the course of a single weekend. Snow arrived properly on the 8th. Not the tentative early dustings that had been appearing since late October, but actual accumulation, 8 inches overnight, the kind that changed the sound of everything and made the cabin feel both smaller and more solid simultaneously. Ghost experienced his first serious snowfall with an expression that Ethan could only describe as professionally suspicious. He walked out onto the porch on that first morning, looked at the altered landscape, and spent 4 full minutes standing in the snow, conducting what appeared to be a reassessment of every conclusion he'd reached about the property's geography. Then he looked at Ethan. "Yeah," Ethan said, "it snows here." Ghost stepped off the porch and into the snow with the deliberate testing energy of an animal updating its operational maps, and Ethan stood in the doorway with his coffee and watched him and felt something in his chest that was warm in a way that had nothing to do with the coffee. Physical therapy with a woman named Renata Okafor at the Kalispell VA was, as advertised, unpleasant. She was 45, Nigerian-American, had a PT doctorate from the University of Washington, and the specific, cheerful mercilessness of someone who genuinely believed in the work and saw your pain as evidence the process was engaged. She looked at his MRI from the original injury, looked at his more recent imaging from the orthopedic follow-up, and said, "You've been compensating with the wrong muscles for 2 years and re-injuring the same tissue repeatedly. We're going to fix your movement patterns before we do anything else." "How long?" Ethan said. "Depends how stubborn you are." "That's not 6 to 8 weeks for the acute issues, longer for the compensation patterns." She looked at Ghost, who had come in with him and was sitting near the door. "Does he go everywhere with you?" "Most places." "Good. The accountability structure is useful." She said it without irony. "People who have something watching them tend to show up." Ghost went to every PT session. He sat near the door and observed the exercises with the alert neutrality of an auditor. And on the days Ethan wanted to quit something early, which was most days because PT at the level Renata required was tedious and painful and humbling in specific ways he hadn't anticipated, Ghost's presence produced the same external requirement Dr. Chu had described 6 weeks ago. Something watching. Something that needed him to show up. He showed up. By the end of November, he was walking without the cane on even terrain for the first time in 8 months. Renata told him this with the satisfaction of a craftsperson looking at completed work, and he stood in the PT corridor without the cane and felt the floor under both feet with equal weight and didn't say anything for a moment because the moment had a quality to it that didn't need commentary. Ghost was watching from near the door. "Good," Ethan said, to both of them. The letter from the Marine Corps arrived on the 1st of December. It was formal, on letterhead, and it came with a secondary document that was not formal, a handwritten note on plain paper, clipped to the inside of the envelope. The formal letter was the 6-month provisional continuation confirmation, standard language, signed by Major Voss. The handwritten note was 2 paragraphs in a precise, familiar hand that Ethan recognized from 9 years of written mission briefs, because the colonel had always done his briefs by hand when the security environment didn't require electronic documentation, and his handwriting was the same in all contexts, small, upright, completely legible. It said, The K-9 Office Curriculum Committee has incorporated Dr. Juan's case notes into the updated MWD Post-Handler Loss Protocol. Your behavioral logs are being used as the primary reference document. You should know that. The second thing you should know is that Marcus's parents have been asking about the dog since the mission, his mother specifically. I've held off telling them because the situation was unresolved. It's resolved now. With your permission, I'd like to give them your contact information. Ethan read it twice, set it on the kitchen table. Ghost came and put his chin on the table and looked at the letter. He did this occasionally with documents, the same investigative nosework he applied to everything unfamiliar, and Ethan had stopped finding it strange about 3 weeks in. Marcus's family, Ethan said. Ghost looked at him. Yeah, I know. He picked up the phone and called the colonel. Give them my number, he said when the colonel answered. You're sure? Yes. It might be a difficult conversation. I've had difficult conversations. A pause. She deserves to know he's okay. The colonel didn't say anything for a moment, then, I'll send it today. Oh. Linda Tran called on a Thursday evening in the second week of December. Her voice was 70 years old and Vietnamese accented and entirely composed, which Ethan had not expected and which made the call harder in a specific way. He'd been braced for grief and received instead a woman who had been grieving for 14 months and had arrived somewhere on the other side of the acute phase, into the territory where grief became something you carried rather than something that was carrying you. Colonel Draper told me you found him, she said. He found me, more accurately. A pause. How is he? Ethan looked at Ghost, who was in his sphinx position near the fireplace that Ethan had started using in November. The firelight moved on his coat. His eyes were half closed. He's good, Ethan said. He's really good, Mrs. Tran. Marcus talked about him every time he called home. He said Ghost was the best partner he'd ever had. A pause. He said that about you too, that you were a good man. The firelight moved. He was the best I knew, Ethan said. It came out without the careful management he usually applied to sentences about Marcus, which surprised him and didn't at the same time. The last 6 weeks had been doing something to the internal architecture that kept those sentences buttoned down, loosening things gradually without announcement. Linda Tran was quiet for a moment. Can I ask, is he happy, the dog? Ethan thought about Ghost running the perimeter in the first snow. Ghost sitting with Callie Nordstrom in the pine stand. Ghost across his legs in the dark on the second night, when the nightmare tried to come back and didn't quite make it. I think he's found his footing again, he said. Good. A pause. I think Marcus would have wanted him with someone who understood what they did together. The colonel told me you were that person. I'm trying to be. You found him, she said simply. That's enough. After the call, he sat in the chair by the fireplace for a long time. Ghost came over and put his head on Ethan's knee. The heavy, deliberate press of his full skull weight, the same gesture from the shelter corridor, replicated now in the warm amber light of a December evening in a cabin in Montana. Ethan put his hand on the back of his head. Your guy was something, he said quietly. Ghost's tail moved once. Christmas came and went without drama, which was itself a form of progress. Ethan drove to Kalispell for a session with Dr. Chu on the 23rd, and she spent the first 20 minutes reviewing what she called the functional indicators: sleep quality, social contact, substance use, physical activity, session attendance, and then put her notepad down and said, You look different. How? Less like someone bracing for something. He thought about that. I'm still bracing. I know. You probably always will be, to some degree. That's not a failure, it's just your nervous system. The question is whether you're bracing and living at the same time. She looked at him. Are you? He thought about the PT sessions, and the behavioral log, and Linda Tran's voice on the phone, and Ghost in the snow, and Callie Nordstrom's hand on Ghost's neck, saying he made me feel like someone was there. He thought about the handwritten note from the colonel, and the morning he'd walked without the cane, and the night 2 weeks ago, when he'd woken at 3 a.m. from the courtyard dream, and Ghost had been already standing before Ethan's eyes were open, already present, already doing the thing he did. Yeah, he said, I am. She nodded once, picked up her notepad. On Christmas Day, he made breakfast. Actual breakfast. Eggs and toast, the kind that required more than standing over a pot. And Ghost sat under the kitchen table in the specific location that had become his spot during meal preparation, monitoring for anything that might require intervention. The radio on the counter played a Missoula station that went in and out. Outside the window, the snow on the ridge had gone blue-white in the flat December light. He thought about last Christmas, the cabin, the particular quality of that silence, which had been the silence of a space that didn't know it was supposed to be a home. The silence this year had a different character. It had something breathing in it. The second quarterly review came in January, conducted remotely by Dr. Juan and a different Marine Corps representative because Voss was on assignment in Okinawa. It lasted 40 minutes and ended with a standard continuation finding and a note from Juan that said the behavioral trajectory was, in her assessment, among the most complete post-trauma rehabilitations documented in working dog placement records, and that she intended to submit it as a case study to the Journal of Veterinary Behavioral Medicine. Ethan told Ghost about it that evening while they were running the trail above the cabin, the one they'd been running 3 times a week since Renata had cleared him for uneven terrain in December. Ghost was ranging about 15 feet ahead, nose working, moving with the loose efficiency of an animal that had rebuilt its muscle mass on regular meals and purposeful work, and the specific caloric needs of a dog that covered serious ground every day. "You're going to be in a veterinary journal," Ethan said. Ghost glanced back at him, kept moving. "I know, you're not impressed." The trail crested the ridge and opened onto the overlook, the specific point where you could see the cabin roof through the trees and the mountains beyond, and on clear days, a thin silver line in the far distance that might have been a river, or might have been the particular way light fell on certain ridgelines. It was clear today. January clear, the air so dry and cold it had a mineral quality, and everything in the long sight line was razor-edged and exact. They stopped there. They always stopped there. Ghost sat beside him without being asked. They looked at the mountains. He thought about the shelter. 3:56 p.m. on a rainy October afternoon, 13 minutes left on a clock. He thought about how close the margin had been, not in the dramatic way, but in the ordinary way, the way most things were close. A different day, a different shift at the shelter, a therapist who hadn't pushed hard enough, a veteran who'd stayed in the truck. Any of those variables and he drives home empty-handed, and the clock hits 4 o'clock, and the corridor door opens, and something irreversible happens. The margin was 13 minutes and one person who didn't stay in the truck. He thought about Marcus saying, apparently in a classified debrief he'd never read, that Ethan took the work personally without letting it be personal. He thought about how that was both accurate and incomplete. The way most things Marcus said about people were accurate and incomplete, because Marcus had been an exceptionally perceptive man working with limited time and imperfect information, same as everyone. The truth was messier than that. The truth was that Ethan had let it be personal plenty, had been letting it be personal for 2 years in a cabin with too many empty bottles and 12-day stretches without leaving, had been doing the broken version of that equation without the functional version to balance it. The functional version turned out to require a structure he hadn't built for himself. External requirement, living weight, something that needed him to show up. The functional version turned out to require a dog. He'd never tell Dr. Chu that he'd resisted it for 6 weeks after she suggested it. She already knew. She knew everything and wrote approximately half of it down, which was the part that had clinical utility, and filed the other half in the part of her understanding that informed how she asked questions without becoming the answer itself. "She was right," he said aloud. Ghost looked at him. "Don't let it go to your head." Ghost looked back at the mountains. In February, Megan Brooks called. She called on a Wednesday morning, which was one of the trail days, and Ethan answered from the overlook with Ghost sitting beside him and the mountains blue and white in the February light. "I wanted to check in," she said. "Officially, the transfer file is closed on our end. Unofficially, Jennifer has asked me about Ghost every week since October. Tell her he's good." "I will. She'll want photographic evidence. I'll send something." He paused. "How are things at the shelter?" A pause on her end. "We've made some changes. After everything, after what happened with Shadow, with Ghost, I pushed the board for a behavioral specialist consultation before any euthanasia decision on high-drive dogs. We got a part-time consultant from Missoula, former military K-9 trainer." She paused. We've had 4 dogs in the last 3 months that would have been put down under the old protocol. All 4 placed. He was quiet for a moment. That's good work, Megan. It's the obvious work. We should have done it years ago. Her voice had the particular flatness of someone being honest about an institutional failure without self-pity. But we do it now. That's what we've got. After the call, he stood on the overlook for a while longer than usual. 4 dogs. He did not know their names or their histories or what they'd been through or what homes they'd found. He knew they were alive and placed, and that the direct line between them and this overlook ran through a rainy October afternoon and a 13-minute window and a shelter director who had written on a piece of paper, "He's not vicious, he's lost." There is a difference, and I am the only person in this building who seems to think it matters. She'd mattered. Dave Parrish, who'd put the tray down. Jennifer, who'd cried quietly and pretended not to. The Colonel, with his classified records and his handwritten note. Renata Okafor, with her cheerful mercilessness. Dr. Chu, who'd pushed exactly hard enough and known when to stop pushing. Linda Tran, who'd called on a December evening and said you found him like it was simple. None of them had done anything extraordinary. They'd each just done the thing that was in front of them, with what they had, at the time it was needed. Which was, he understood now, what most recoveries were actually made of. Not single transformative moments, but the accumulation of people doing the next available thing. Ghost pressed against his leg. "Okay," Ethan said. "Let's go." "What?" The 6-month review happened in April, conducted by Major Voss in person, which meant she'd driven up from Missoula for it, rather than doing it remotely, which Ethan registered as a signal of something without knowing exactly what. She came to the cabin, which was also different from the formal board setting. She sat at the kitchen table with a coffee that she held in both hands against the April cold, and looked at the behavioral log binder, the full 6 months of it, 3 binders now, and the PT documentation and the VA treatment records, and didn't say much for a long time. Ghost sat at the other end of the kitchen and watched her with the professional neutrality he applied to all visitors. He had started, around month 3, to differentiate between people who required sustained monitoring and people who could be assessed and then ignored. He'd filed Megan Brooks under the latter after about 4 minutes of her February visit. Voss he was still watching. "The case study ran in the veterinary journal," she said. "I heard. Juan has gotten 12 inquiries from other VA facilities about the protocol. 3 of them are implementing pilot programs." She turned a page in the log. "Your logs are the reference document. Ghost recovery is the reference document. I just wrote it down." She looked at him over her coffee. "That's a distinction without a difference, Mercer." He didn't argue it. "The board's position at 6 months," she said, "is permanent placement approval, pending annual welfare checks. No more quarterly reviews." She said it in her direct military way. Information delivered cleanly, without ceremony. "The provisional designation is removed." The kitchen was quiet. Ghost's ears moved. "Permanent," Ethan said. "Permanent. Full transfer of custodial responsibility. He's yours." She paused. "Officially." He looked at Ghost. Ghost was looking back at him. In the 6 months since October, his coat had filled out from the lean, stress-worn condition of the shelter into something dense and healthy, and he carried himself with the ease of an animal that had found, after considerable searching, the specific environment in which it was fully capable of being what it was. The scar on his muzzle had faded from angry pink to pale silver. His eyes were the same, yellow, precise, assessing, but the quality of what was behind them had changed. The constant high-alert vigilance of the shelter had become something more like steady attention. The difference between a fist and an open hand, applying the same amount of force for completely different reasons. "One more thing," Voss said. She pulled an envelope from her jacket and set it on the table. "The Commandant's office. They want to know if Ghost can attend a K9 recognition ceremony at Quantico in June. Posthumous citation for Marcus Tran's unit. Ghost was part of the operational record." She paused. "It's voluntary. I told them I'd ask." Ethan picked up the envelope, held it. "We'll be there," he said. Quantico in June was hot in the specific way of Virginia in early summer, dense, green-heavy, the kind of heat that arrived with humidity and required adjustment from anyone coming from the dry cold of Montana. Ethan wore his dress uniform for the first time since the Arlington service, and it fit differently than it had then. Not just the physical difference of a body that had been through surgery and PT in a Montana winter, but something else. Something in the way he wore it. Less like armor, more like a record. Ghost wore his service harness with the MARSOC unit patch restored, a new one, properly stitched, courtesy of the K9 office, replacing the worn-out original. He walked at heel through the ceremony grounds with the formal precision of a dog who understood, in whatever way dogs understood things, that this occasion had a specific weight to it. The colonel was there. They stood together during the citation reading, which covered Marcus Tran's operational record in the careful, compressed language of military commendations, the kind that conveyed everything through what it implied and confirmed nothing that remained classified. The colonel's face was the face he wore in formal settings, correct, still, giving nothing away. Ethan watched him and thought about the handwritten note and the cold beers in Mali and a debrief he'd never be cleared to read. Linda Tran was there. He'd known she would be, and had not known how he'd handle it. He'd thought about it on the flight from Missoula and had not arrived at a plan, which was unusual for him, and which he'd decided to treat as information. That some things didn't benefit from planning, and this was one of them. She was small, 72 years old, in a dark blue dress, with the bearing of someone who had built something out of loss and was wearing it quietly. She saw Ghost before she saw Ethan, and she stopped walking. Ghost looked at her. Then he did something he had never done with a stranger. He walked forward, not at heel, not on command, just walked forward the length of his leash, and sat in front of her and looked up at her face with his yellow eyes. Linda Tran put her hand on his head. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Her hand moved slowly over his ears, his neck, the way people touch things they'd needed to touch for a long time and had not been able to reach. Ghost held the sit, held the contact. "He looks like Marcus described him," she said finally. "He is what Marcus built," Ethan said. "All of it. Still." She looked up from Ghost to Ethan. Her eyes were the specific, clear, direct quality of someone who had finished crying about something a long time ago and was now just living in the true shape of it. "Thank you," she said, "for the call, for telling me he was all right." "He is all right." "You both are," she said. It wasn't a question. He didn't have a quick answer to that. The true answer was the same one he'd given Dr. Chu back in December. Yes, and it's ongoing, and it's not the same as finished, and those are not the same thing. But Linda Tran already understood that. She'd understood it for 14 months longer than he had. "Yeah," he said, "we both are." After the ceremony, they stood together in the shade of the building's overhang. Linda Tran, the colonel, Ethan, Ghost, and talked for a while about Marcus in the way you talked about people after enough time had passed, with specifics, with actual humor, with the particular attention that grief pays to detail, because detail is what it has left. The colonel told a story about Marcus in a planning meeting in 2020 that Ethan hadn't heard. Linda Tran told a story about Marcus at 14 that made the colonel laugh, which was a thing Ethan had seen happen maybe 4 times in 9 years. Ghost lay in the shade between Ethan and Linda Tran with his chin on his paws and his eyes half closed. He'd done his job. The assessment was complete. These were not threats. These were people who belonged in the same place, at the same time, for reasons that predated his involvement in any of their lives, and that he had, in his way, helped make possible. He rested. They flew back to Montana on a Sunday. Drove from Missoula to the cabin in the early evening, through the mountains in the long June light, the kind of light that lasted until nearly 10 o'clock and turned everything gold and specific. Ghost rode in the back seat. The cabin looked the same. It always looked the same. That was one of the things he'd come to appreciate about it. The consistency of it in all weather and all seasons. The way it sat in the same relationship to the ridge and the pines and the sound of the creek at the bottom of the property, regardless of what had happened since he'd last seen it. He parked. Let Ghost out. Stood in the gravel. The air smelled like pine and cold creek water, and the particular early summer quality of mountain evenings that he had no single word for and did not need one. Ghost was already on his perimeter check. Upper right, lower left, woodpile, outbuilding, full sweep. The same sequence, the same efficiency, the same deliberate exactness he brought to it every single time. Sit. All clear. Ethan walked to the porch and stood there for a moment, looking at the ridge going amber in the last light. His knee was fine, his cane was inside, leaned against the wall near the door, where it had been for 6 weeks. Available, just not necessary. Ghost came and sat beside him. 2 things that had been broken, both still imperfect, both still carrying the specific weight of what they'd been through, both standing on a porch in the June evening light in a mountain cabin in Montana that had become, in the way things became things, gradually, without announcement, through accumulated ordinary days, a home. The ridge went from amber to copper. The creek ran its cold sound from the bottom of the property. Neither of them moved. The most dangerous dog in Redstone Valley. Animal Center. The animal that had bent a door frame, injured 3 handlers, and sat in total silence while everyone waited for him to become something they already believed he was lying on the porch of a mountain cabin, watching the mountains with his handler at the end of a Tuesday in June, with nothing to prove and nowhere else to be. And the veteran who'd driven to a shelter on a therapist's orders and had sat in his truck in the rain for 2 minutes trying to decide if he was going to go in, was standing on that same porch, without a cane, with a dog whose name he'd spoken once in a shelter corridor and who had sat down and waited for him to figure out what came next. They had not saved each other in the clean, single-moment way of stories that prefer their meaning obvious and their edges smooth. They had saved each other in the real way, slowly, imperfectly, through the repetition of small acts of showing up until showing up became, without either of them deciding it, the shape of who they were. The mountains held their position. The evening held its light. And on the porch, in the quiet, 2 things that had been lost found each other again. Not because it was inevitable, not because they deserved it, but because one of them didn't stay in the truck. The ones who need you most will rarely be able to ask. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to